started. I wanted to begin by thanking you all for your patience and your willingness to adapt to the changes that have been thrown at you around this lecture. We're glad to have it finally happening. So I'm happy to welcome you to the 2018 J. Harry Cotton Lecture in Philosophy. The J. Harry Cotton Fund in Philosophy was established in 1977 to honor longtime philosophy professor J. Harry Cotton, who taught at Wabash College from 1947 to 1969. A fund was generously endowed by alumni of the college, philosophy majors and minors, who took courses from Professor Cotton. The initial purpose of this fund was to establish the J. Harry Cotton Prize, given to the senior who has done the best work in philosophy during the year and who exemplifies the qualities manifested by Cotton himself, humanity and scholarship in the liberal arts tradition. In 1984, the fund also began to sponsor the J. Harry Cotton Lectureship in Philosophy, which would bring a distinguished philosopher to campus on occasion. In 1984, the first J. Harry Cotton Lecture was given by Gregory Vlastos, a scholar in ancient philosophy from Princeton University. Since that time, every few years, we have invited a philosopher to campus to give this lecture. Thanks to the generosity of our alumni over the last 40 years, we now intend to sponsor a J. Harry Cotton Lecture every year to ensure that philosophy is represented not only in the awards chapel, but also in the mix of excellent speakers and programs at Wabash College. James Harry Cotton was born in 1898 and died in 1982. He earned a bachelor's degree at the College of Worcester and a PhD at Princeton, and honorary degrees from Worcester in 1929 and Wabash in 1938. He left Worcester in the middle of his college years to serve in the First World War. While in graduate school, he was an assistant professor at Worcester and then pastored a Presbyterian church in Columbus, Ohio from 1928 to 1940. After taking his doctorate from Princeton and during his time as pastor, he lectured at universities and missions in India, China, and Japan. Before coming to Wabash, Dr. Cotton was the president of McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. One of his students at McCormick Seminary, Raymond B. Knutson, who went on to become a pastor and a trustee of Alma College in Michigan, tells the story of Dr. Cotton finding out around Christmas time that Knutson's son was sick, calling him into his office and giving him a check to make sure the family had a good Christmas. This kind of humanitarian spirit is evident in much of his life. He came to Wabash in 1947 and served as the chair of the philosophy department until 1961, when he left Wabash to be a department head at Harvard Divinity School. In 1964, he returned to Wabash from Harvard and taught here until 1969. He published 3 books, The Christian Experience of Life, Christian Knowledge of God, and Royce on the Human Self, and numerous articles, most notably Philosophy of Religion and on Josiah Royce. In a recent presidential address to the Josiah Royce Society at the occasion of their 150th anniversary of Royce's birth, Professor John J. McDermott, leading Royce scholar, began with thanks to, and I quote, the earlier and influential work of J. Harry Cotton. At Wabash, Cotton taught a 2-semester Introduction to Philosophy course and is described by one former student as wearing tweed, smoking a pipe as he taught, often rattling off paragraphs of Plato or Aristotle in Greek. You think you have it bad now. He was the president of the American Theological Society and the Indiana Philosophical Association. Dr. Cotton was a politically engaged academic, advocating for civil rights, free speech for communists, anti-imperialism, and peace around the world before those things became respectable opinions. In 1933, he served as a delegate at the Ohio Convention to ratify the 21st Amendment that outlawed the production and sale of alcohol. His wife was an alternate delegate to the Democratic National Convention in 1956, where Adlai Stevenson was nominated. Cotton served on the Presbyterian Church's Special Committee on a Righteous Peace in 1943, which was part of an ecumenical effort to seek a firm foundation for peace around the world. He was a member, along with Mary McLeod Bethune, civil rights and women's rights activist and influential educator, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Baptist pastor and 4th Black person in the 20th century to be elected to Congress, Philip Jaffe, Elmore Rice, the American playwright, and Mary E. Woolley, the first woman to attend Brown and the first president of Mount Holyoke University, of the American Round Table on India, which supported Indian independence from British rule in coordinated efforts with the NAACP, and was described in the California Senate Special Report on Education as a communist front. I mention this remarkable cast to note the historical significance and radicality of the community with whom Cotton wished to align himself. In 1944, Cotton gave an address in which he charged students to consider the importance of liberal arts in changing the world. He spoke of an urgency of addressing the liberal arts to the issues facing our shared world that is remarkable for remaining so timely. In it, he said, quote, "We are now beginning to understand that not only our political freedom, but our academic liberty is in danger. That the very civilization that has nurtured our liberal arts tradition is threatened. That the world can no longer tolerate the luxury of Olympian aloofness on the part of its university people. In other words, the college must be aware of political issues. It must be stirred by the prospects of post-war unemployment. It has a stake in Negro slums and in the labor unions. If the liberal arts college persists in its treason, it will encounter the usual penalty of this offense, the death sentence. It is for the life of the liberal arts tradition that I am pleading." It is in this spirit of humanity and scholarship that we are pleased to hold the annual J. Harry Cotton Lecture in Philosophy this year. So it is now my pleasure to introduce this year's J. Harry Cotton Lecturer in Philosophy, Professor Kris Sealey. Dr. Sealey graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Mathematics and a minor in Philosophy from Spelman College. She received her MA and PhD in Philosophy from the University of Memphis. She is an Associate Professor of Philosophy at Fairfield University, where she has been on the faculty since 2006, the Director of Peace and Justice Studies program there, and one of the co-directors of the Curriculum Development for Fairfield University's Center for Academic Excellence. She is currently the Director of Philosophy in an Inclusive Key, PIXI, at Penn State, a week-long workshop that brings together college students from historically marginalized groups who are studying philosophy. The deadline was January 31st, so consider applying next year. She's the head PI on a grant project that I am also involved with, funded by Mellon, aimed at developing a code of ethics for publishing in philosophy, where I have been the beneficiary of her thoughtful insight, dogged commitment to the idea that entrenched practices can be improved, and her administrative prowess. She has previously served on the Secretariat of the Caribbean Philosophical Association and is the chair of the Committee on Racial and Ethnic Diversity at SPEP, the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy. Dr. Sealey's published articles can be found in academic journals such as Critical Philosophy of Race, Hypatia, a journal for feminist philosophy, Levinas Studies, Research in Phenomenology, the Journal for the British Society for Phenomenology, Continental Philosophy Review. Her book, Moments of Disruption, Levinas, Sartre, and the Question of Transcendence, was published in December 2013 with SUNY Press. Her current book project, Creolizing the Nation, the Argument for an Alternative Ontology, investigates the relationship between community formations, Creolizing process of identity formation, and the nation. She generally works in the areas of continental philosophy, philosophy of race, and post-colonial theory. At the conclusion of her talk, we will have about 15-20 minutes for a Q&A. I want to offer special gratitude to Professor Sealey for her preparations for this talk. As many of you know, the original date of this talk had to be canceled due to weather in the Northeast. Soon after that, her laptop with this talk on it fizzled. She was lucky enough to find a company that was able to restore all of her materials, but on Friday, when I last spoke to her, she had not yet received it, and so she rewrote the talk, only to receive several hours later the full contents of her hard drive back. So we are very grateful to Professor Sealey, both for planning this trip twice and for writing this talk twice. Please give her a warm Wabash welcome.
Yeah, we've been through some journey together already. It's good to finally meet you guys in person. Thank you so much for coming. I'm overwhelmed by the support and the presence. It's a full room, save for like 2 seats, so thank you for that. And thank you to Dr. Trott for that amazing introduction and welcome and just overall friendship. I appreciate you. So I want to make sure we have time for questions because that's the funnest part of doing this sort of stuff. So I'm going to dive right in. I have a slide that's just, it's not super fancy, it's just to sort of help everyone kind of stay along and follow the direction of where I want to take us. So let me, right, so I have that firsthand. All right, so this is the title of both talks actually. I kept the title saved. And so I wanted to share with you today some of the concerns and questions that landed me into my current book project, tentatively titled, as Dr. Trott said, Creolizing the Nation, an Argument for an Alternative Ontology. So we're not going to let the ontology part of things bog us down too much, but I do hope to convey what I mean in this proposal to creolize the nation, why I think it's a noteworthy venture to undertake, and the stakes involved in doing it right now in our contemporary moment. So like feminist scholar Chandra Mohanty, I can't remember exactly when my transition from foreign students to students of color happened, but I do know that it did. More than likely somewhere between graduating from Spelman College and my third year or so in a PhD program at Memphis. I have the privilege to think back on it now, some 20 or so years later, and I still feel the disorientation. As a foreign student, I came to the American South from a country in which I was very much part of the majority in terms of race, though that too is a long and complicated story to which we can return if time permits. But what this means was, or what this meant, was that at Spelman College, I was an international student, finding community with other international students. It was an experience of not quite fitting in to the HBCU experience in the American South, knowing full well that the self that was socially constructed for me, a self for which I had to take responsibility, should have been able to fit in. So fast forward a few years later to Memphis, Tennessee, where I find myself still a citizen of Trinidad, still calling that place home. A graduate student, woman of color, right? So no longer just or only an international student in this PhD program in philosophy. Now, to say a few things about the profession of philosophy, and Dr. Trott can co-sign this, it lags behind most, if not all, disciplines in its diversity across race and gender. And so what that means is that it really mattered that I was a graduate student of color at Memphis. It mattered because the philosopher of color was and is charged with diversifying the discipline of philosophy. Not simply with the presence of her body, but with the texts that she chooses in her classroom, the voices of color, in my case voices of women, that she included on her syllabi, and lastly, she diversified the discipline with the subfields that she specialized in, or specializes in. So to be sure, my foreignness inflected my place in academic philosophy, but for the most part, the expectation was for my alliances to be with the experience of struggle and resistance coming out of the experience of being Black in America. And so I was like, okay, that's cool. Black diasporic thought is rich and captivating, and I enjoyed engaging with the text. But this was all relatively new to me in ways that it wasn't to other women of color in my cohort. You might ask, well, what was I doing all those years at Spelman College anyway? Well, for one, being profoundly homesick and alienated from the community around me. By year 6 of my graduate studies, I wasn't the student of color the way my community assumed me to be, but I was this sufficiently to maneuver through the social spaces and demonstrate some modicum of cultural fluency. I wasn't quite the foreign student I was in 1997 either. 7 years had passed, and my returns back home became trips at the end of which I was ready to return home back to Memphis. So I share these moments with you because they reveal one of the foundational premises of my proposal to creolize the nation. And that is, to borrow again from Chandra Mohanty, to see the idea, and this is a quote, to see the idea of a coherent, historically continuous and stable self as a fiction. My journey up the Atlantic, through the American South, and up the East Coast shows me that quite literally, what I am and have been is relational in nature. Relational in that I am connected in all sorts of convoluted ways to the historically situated communities of which I happen to be a part. Reflections and moments like these, and I've had many, reveal how notions of home, belonging, and nationality are packed with all sorts of rich and deep complexities. For instance, I'm at a point where I can begin thinking about becoming a U.S. citizen. But as I think through this possibility, I wonder what that would mean. What would it not mean? What sorts of historical legacies would I be called to inherit? And could I even take it on? I don't know if it means that I need to start liking apple pie. And I don't like apple pie. Right? So there are lots to sort out. And so here I am working on this book about what this orientation towards nationness means and conveys. If I'm right to read from my experiences that who we are as individuals is much better understood in terms of how we are together, and perhaps also why we are together, then it's also the case that the national communities we call home are also relational entities. That is, these spaces of belonging are less of a static and unchanging what, and more of a dialogic and relational how that reflects the interconnected movements among human beings like us, making communities together about the cultural, aesthetic, and discursive matrices from which we want to derive shelter. And so now, let's talk a little bit about the ontology. So I promise not to bog us down too much in this whole ontology bit, and I'm still holding myself to that promise, but permit me to say at least this. My project is really an argument for an alternative ontology. And here's a little bit about what that means and about why that's the case. So in a conversation about the intersections between science and politics, astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, do we know who he is? I'm assuming we do, right? So deGrasse Tyson and former President Bill Clinton summarize as follows the driving motivations of scientific inquiry. So this is what they say. The scientist either tries to understand how multiple and different phenomena are alike, despite there being many, or she prioritizes the extent to which they are different or many, despite their similarities. Both Tyson and President Clinton identify the former of these two approaches, that is, deriving common similarities among things that are multiple and different, as the most scientifically lucrative approach. And this is because in determining the unifying principles through which differences can be thought of in terms of their similarity, us human beings have been able to generate a world that is categorized, systematic, and most importantly, useful. In other words, these unifying principles have armed our knowledge-producing systems, which is the sciences, with a capacity for control, a capacity to generate a world in which we might find orientation, and also a world in which we might be the center. So ultimately, this ontology, this is what I'm arguing, carries over into the political with significant implications for the question of human difference, and for how difference figures in these practices of homemaking and belonging within the political culture of modern nationalism. And so, in Creolizing the Nation, I show that an ontology that facilitates desires for order and control, an ontology that responds to our need for orientation and for centering, frames the politics and culture of the nation. And within this frame, difference fairly consistently registers as either social contamination to be purified away, or at best, in need of quarantine. Latina feminist Maria Lugones shows that this urge to control is most fundamental to these political orientations towards human difference. She writes, and I quote, "If we assume that the world of people and things is unified, then we can conceive of a vantage point from which that unity can be grasped. The conception of this vantage point follows our urge to control," end quote. So in other words, the location of this vantage point is also the location of the urge to control. And it's the enabler of this urge to control. So we begin with what looks like a disinvested ontology, void of any political agenda, and because it's scientifically objective. But if scholars like Lugones are right, an organization of reality that reduces the many to the one is really an ontology that not only coddles our passion for control, but legitimizes it, precisely by leaving it out of or behind the scene of critical analysis. It's the organizational frame in the natural sciences, and it's also the organizational frame out of which we generate our expectations for home, community, and belonging. So the claim I want to make in my current project is that such constructions of home are not inevitable. I know they're common, I know they're what we're used to, but my claim is that they're not inevitable. That there are other ways of organizing community and belonging. These other ways are possible. And that this other way emerges when we bring our critical attention to the ontological commitments of creolization. So, now on to my next slide. What does creolization do? All right, so perhaps the question that everybody has is, what the heck does this chick mean by creolization? So we'll try to answer that question. And I have some pictures for you. So on this slide, given that it's lunchtime, I thought it would be appropriate. On this slide are two wonderful pictures of delicious gumbo. You know what gumbo is? Yes? If you don't, you're missing out. Go find out. And then on the other side are pictures of what in Trinidad signifies as mythological monstrous creature who is always or most often female. And we call this creature a supunya. Can everybody say that out loud? Say it again. Good, you ready to come home? So a supunya is a mythical creature whose abilities to kill and haunt and taunt are very reminiscent of a vampire. So she is a sort of cross between figures that you find in African mythologies and African spiritual practices, and what the French brought to the Caribbean islands, specifically Trinidad, in their colonization venture. And so I put these two things up because both gumbo and the functioning of this supunya mythical creature is what I want us to think about when we think about creolization, right? Bringing two discursive practices together, either in food or in myth or in language or in religion, in ways that are surprising precisely because they really should never have come into one place in the first place, right? So that's what that's to help us with. So broadly defined, right, broad definitions. Creolization names a cultural process through which disparate communities find themselves, for various historically contingent reasons, in an unavoidable web of relationality. In that meeting place, these communities are too far removed from their respective homelands, right? So return is a foreclosed option, and too closely interconnected with this new place to avoid some kind of indigeneity. So these Creole communities are experienced as new or different modes of existence that quite simultaneously sustain versions of the old or predating cultural codes. So the past returns as a different past into the present. So it's also not the case that the Creole is constituted or created out of nothing, since there is a clear harkening back to what came before, right? But I don't know if you can see clearly, but in this image, there are definitely vestiges of a vampire sort of creature. So that is to say, history matters for a Creole community, whose social location and even identity marks the community in important ways. As such, and perhaps a little bit paradoxically, Creolization maintains traditions right alongside their futuricity. So there's a repurposing of the traditional in the present for the sake of the future. In other words, in Creolization, many remain as such as they are gathered into some Creole constitutive one. Ronaldo Walcott, who's a Creolist scholar, articulates this well when he describes the communal negotiations of Creole communities in the Caribbean as, quote, a rethinking of community that might allow for different ways of cohering into some form of recognizable political community, where singularities make themselves cohere into oneness or into a community of singularities, end quote. Among these Creolist scholars, the consensus is that these Creole ways of being are very specific to historical conditions of oppression that undermine the self-determination and even the humanity of the cultures in question. So to that end, meetings that produce Creole indigeneity, Creole identity, and Creole relationships are always across an unequal power terrain that differentially situates the original cultures in question. So as a consequence, communities against whom this skewed power terrain is oppressive have to invent the conditions upon which their shelter and thriving become possible. Jean Rouch described them as, quote, communities of the rejected, of people who have withstood contempt as they create a new way of life, end quote. Omanisi Natasha Tinsley, another Creolist scholar, returns us to the chattel slavery economy of these communities in the Caribbean, describing their generative ways of being, quote, as, quote, making connection in ways that commodified flesh was never supposed to, end quote. So out of this objection arise the cultural forms that produce, very much against all odds, sheltered and homely spaces from which actual expressions of humanity can emerge. So to this end, not only do Creolized communities provide shelter conditions, but they also do so as acts of resistance against social conditions that ought to foreclose the possibility of being at home. So one of the central claims of my project is that in the resistive aspect of Creole homemaking practices, we might find a divestment from those practices that frame difference in terms of contagion or impurity. So, because of the historical legacy of the Antilles, the Caribbean islands are often identified as harboring both the sufficient and necessary conditions for Creolization, right? So Africans were stolen en masse and put on sugar and cotton plantations to be sources of free labor. European slave masters and overseers lived in close quarters with these New World slaves. East Indian indentured laborers were lured across the Atlantic to replace this free labor once slavery was abolished on many of the islands. So all of that to say, one can well imagine the inevitable diversity across which Caribbean Creolization took and takes place. In other words, negotiations of difference and otherness are simply the order of the day in a process that brings together ways of being, linguistic differences, and spiritual commitments that ought to never have found themselves in the same place or at the same time. And yet, here are these diverse communities of people together as a consequence of forced transplantation, voluntary migration, and everything else in between, determining relational webs out of which community, political coherence, and even home might emerge. So what might such indigenation happening despite and in the midst of this diversity tell us about Creole practices of making community and belonging? To the degree that such communities emerge out of a pluriverse of cultural units, all displaced and all out of place and all invested in creating a sense of belonging to where they actually are, the process of creolization seems to open up onto a living with difference that is neither one, the reduction of that difference, or two, the destruction of communal identity or cohesion. So my claim is that in a creolized experience of home, the shelter of home is not produced in xenophobic terms. That is to say, home is experienced in terms of a belonging, the discursive framework of which is resistant to the violence against that which is other. To be sure, if the claim made by Creolist scholars is true, then Creole communities arise in a radical disruption of the violence of that normative order. And included in that violence, indeed giving that violence meaning, is the logic of xenophobia, or rather the more prior logic of purity, out of which the other registers as not fully human, but rather as contamination. So hence, it is precisely this xenophobic calculus that Creole processes will disrupt, or could disrupt. It then follows that in these creolizing spaces, there is also the possibility of an alternative framing of community and of hope. So, next slide. So now I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking about, or how I'm thinking about this alternative ontology. So for these reasons, I'm interested in uncovering this on the ontological premises upon which Creole homemaking practices find realization. What might one say about this alternative organization of being, or this alternative ontology? How might many remain as such when they are gathered into this Creole constituted one? Grappling with this question has taken me to the work of Edward Glissant, and I know there are some of us in the room that talked about Edward Glissant with me, a few, good, right, good. So who's Edward Glissant? As a scholar with Martinican roots, Glissant's focus is on the Creole communities of the Franco-Antillean region, communities he describes as bringing diversities into relation in a way that is, quote, neither fusion nor confusion, neither ravenous integration nor muddled nothings, end quote. In other words, to think this differently about the idea of community, Glissant invites his readers to think differently about the idea of human subjectivity, right? Think differently about what it means to be a self. To think otherwise about who we are as selves. His account of rhizomatic existence is one of his most powerful metaphors of such reimagining. And so I'd like to spend some time now on how this metaphor works in Glissant and how it might get us to this alternative ontology needed for creolizing the nation. So what are rhizomes? Any botanists in the room? People who study botany? Like, okay, good. Then you'll be super impressed by myself. Right, so that's a rhizome. That's a very sort of Google search definition of what rhizomes are. Nothing fancy. So I'm not claiming to be a botanist here. And here are more images of rhizomes. And what I want to draw your attention to is the sort of spreadiness of the growth of the rhizome, and the sense in which that spread makes it either difficult or impossible to identify what the sort of central or originating root locus of the rhizome is, because at the very least that's what Glissant wants to do with this metaphor, and that's how he wants to deploy it in thinking about creolization. So, where was I? Okay, good. All right, so again, back to Glissant. If we begin with the image of a seed that sinks roots into the ground, then out of that rootedness, the seed sort of is what it is. And as such, any subsequent variation is but a version of the same, a manifestation of the beginning or the source or the seed. Hence, metaphors of seeds and roots would fail to capture, according to Glissant, what happens in Creole processes, how the old become new, and how one is yet many. Glissant proposes that in order to account for this, we must think of the self, or its identity, or how it possesses reality, as both here and elsewhere, as both itself and as other to itself. On this account, the identity of the self, which is always a self in community with other selves, is a perpetual differing or differentiation, diffracting and returning as always other. In this sense, selfhood does not describe a static and unchanging phenomenon, but rather a movement of sorts, a fluid collusion of differences, always in community with other people. So subjectivity, thus understood, is therefore, to use Glissant's words, quote, a capacity for variation, instead of a substantive and unchanging essence. To return here to the beginning of our conversation, this language of variation allows me, at least, to make sense of the moving collusion of variations of which I am comprised, from foreign student to student of color, to woman of color who, I didn't mention this earlier, but who must now mother a child of color across a foreignness that wasn't quite the same as the foreignness of the foreign student she once was, right? A bunch of stuff. So when I think about Glissant's claim that the production of the self is via a rhizoming of itself, he seems, at least to me, to be right. So as a metaphor, Glissant holds, the rhizome is better equipped than the root to capture all of this. The plant that grows through rhizomes exhibits what looks like a multiplication of itself across a wide range of ground. But in truth and fact, there is no original it that spreads. Rather, out of a one emerges a multiplicity of singular identities, all of which then also expand in a similar sort of rhizomatic way. Rhizomes grow across and not down, and that's significant because this gives us a relationship to depth or an anchorage to place that is different from what we might expect in organisms that establish vertical roots into the ground. The plant that has rhizomed itself is, in a real sense, here, but because its growth is not committed to vertical depth, it's also elsewhere. It is in this amalgamation of here and elsewhere, same and other, that Glissant finds a model for an ontology or an ordering of pieces of reality that captures a capacity for living with difference. To be me is to perpetually become other to myself. It is for identity to be this process of differentiation that is invariably driven by its relationship with others. For Glissant, this metaphor of the rhizome breaks with the kind of root thinking that could never quite capture the ruptured histories out of which Creole communities have grown. And I quote from Glissant. For such communities, much like those in the Caribbean islands, the site of history is characterized by ruptures that began with the brutal dislocation of the slave trade, end quote. So Glissant's work acknowledges this and argues that any conception of community coming out of those experiences would have to be uncoupled from the metaphor of the root. That is to say, a rhizomatic ontology simply captures what in fact are the implications of this particular social history of Creole cultures in the Caribbean. But additionally, the ontology of the rhizome also allows us to understand how out of this ruptured history, Creole communities come to frame difference differently and come to the experience of home and community and belonging differently. This is to the extent that the imagery of rhizomatic growth calls us to conceptualize identity, what quite literally something or someone is, as relational. I'll recall here again the ways in which my journey as an immigrant in and out of various communities, connecting and then disbanding from them in varying degrees, have shaped who I am in foundational and undeniable ways. I would venture that quite arguably that might be the case for all of us, though the transience of the experience of migration might make that more salient. So let's return for a moment to the ways in which the reductive ontology of the nation determines difference in terms of contagion. If it is the case that who I am becoming is always connected to communities of which I happen to be a part, and included in those communities are those who can only show up for me as non-belonging aliens, as those who undermine my security, then this relational aspect of the self, which Glissant proposes, should truly freak us out. It will mean that as relational, I'm always already exposed to what is dangerously other, to what is a threat to my home space. But what if, with an alternative, rhizomatic ontology, what would have showed up as a non-belonging foreignness signifies instead as the other with whom I build conditions for the possibility of emancipatory living, since as relational, we're always mutually and inevitably implicated in the composite nature of our community. Glissant writes, quote, "The root is unique, a stock, taking all upon itself and killing all that is other around it. In opposition to this is the rhizome, and an enmeshed root system with no predatory rootstock taking over permanently," end quote. The root as totalitarian is the root whose being is at the expense of all that is other around it. It is primary and has primacy over all else. It is the root whose beginning is more original and therefore more legitimate. To the contrary, the rhizomatic system just is its capacity for variation. The first, the original, the founding, the grounding stock bears no more legitimacy than later offshoots. It is in this sense that an ontology out of which the imagery of the rhizome is meaningful offers an encounter with differences in terms other than xenophobia, in terms other than those offered by a reductive ontology that will coddle our passion for control. So now to conclude. So it should be noted that Creole communities were vilified to the extent that their mechanisms for social ordering flew in the face of this desire for purity and origin. To not be faithful to such desires was seen as a sign of social and cultural malevolence. We hear the vestiges of this in those calls to take our country back, or to make our country great again, or to make our country ours again, right? Perhaps the political backlash is in response, or perhaps such political backlash might be in response to a creolization of our nation that actually has already begun. Perhaps these calls are grappling with the very fact of relationality, that the cultural aesthetic of our nation's space has never really belonged exclusively to any one of us, to the degree that it has always been refracted and inflected by he, she, or they who is other. As such, the question for the nation is whether it is possible to experience oneself at home in a non-proprietal way. That is to say, can we feel a sense of belonging to a culture that doesn't belong to any one of us, given its rhizomatic pluralism? That's my phrase. A turn to Creolization reveals a radical reimagining of reality, which might render possible such a sense of belonging, or what Paul Gilroy describes as, quote, a new way of being at home in the world, organized by a healthier orientation towards the unsettling experience of otherness, end quote. Hence, through creolizing the nation, I imagine a move away from a national culture that is static, nativist, protectionist, and xenophobic, to one that acknowledges the emergent nature of its national community, and that produces homely spaces absent of claims to wholeness and finality. Hence, the question we might pose to ourselves is whether our expectation of home might be adjusted to include the kind of ambiguity and movement that shapes our contemporary metropoles, and whether or not the political culture of the nation can be uncoupled from this logic of rigid purity without seeing that divestment as a source of the nation's demise. Are our conceptions of citizenship able to reflect an age of creolized belonging and cultural sharing, in which difference is ordinary and cultural mix and matches, to quote my 4-year-old, is just mundane? I would rather not frame such negotiations as a matter of survival, right? So we need to get to the program or be left in the dust of change. I don't want to do that. This seems to be precisely the hyperbolic fear-mongering from which we aim to move away. Instead, I understand such questions to concern at their core visions for a planetary coalition that is pluricultural, humanistic, and dare I say, liberatory for all of us. So I'll leave it there, and thank you. Now,
I think we can have 10 minutes for questions.
I am never that clear.
I was curious, in your research, have you come across a Creolized society that has rejected a outside influence other than the original Creolizing forces?
Right, so that's a good question. And I should have done this in the beginning. So I think about my project as sort of speculative, which is to say, though the history of islands in the Caribbean sort of primed those communities to be the kinds that you would name as Creolized, how in truth and fact in real time those community organizations play out tend to be just as problematic as the national culture that I'm critical of. So in real time, there is this xenophobia and logic of purity and who was here first and, you know, assimilationist. In real time, that's what you see. But what I'm trying to do is generate a speculative space in which we could ask questions about the inevitability of making things, of having things go down like that. And so the short answer to your question is no, not in this universe. But that's okay. Us philosophers don't let that stop us. That whole reality. Thank you. Yes?
How would you compare your ideas to like an idealized version of the melting pot?
Yeah, the melting pot, yeah. There are so many analogies, right? There's melting pot, there's gumbo, there's salad bowl. I came across smoothie the other day. So there's like, yeah, lots of metaphors. Oh my God, my picture's gone. So I would be tentatively okay or tentatively willing to think about this in terms of a melting pot. If by melting pot we don't mean or we don't convey this idea, the idea of requiring differences to lose themselves in some sort of reductive, common sort of oneness that will then be positioned to gatekeep what can enter and what can't enter, or what can belong or what can't belong. So that's ultimately what I want to dismantle, or that's ultimately what I would like this alternative ontology to allow us to say could be dismantled. And you could arguably do that in a melting pot analogy with those kinds of qualifications, I would imagine, right? So in other words, so short answer to your question, if by melting pot we don't mean anything that is reductive and assimilationist, because those are the kinds of dangers that I'm trying to flag, then sure, we can do that.
It's the troubled history in the United States because the melting pot started making Europeans, Eastern Europeans into whites. There's certain people that were melted and others that weren't meltable.
Right. Yeah. So and so that's and so it could take on those sorts of creepy connotations, but I think you could also set it up to mean other sorts of things and still retain the analogy.
The framework, is there any space to account for limited resources to see the different sort of outcomes of this creolization? I mean, I think we would have a completely different experience in a poorer place and a richer place to see how we welcome those two.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so in one version of this talk, I think I have more than two at this point, because I had a long version because I originally had more time, and then I had a short. So, but in an entire section that I cut out. So the project, the name of the project is Creolizing the Nation, and there was a section in which I talked about why I'm not calling it nationalizing the Creole, right? And that's because I don't see, I don't see, because I don't think this is possible, to think about Creolization as a thing that you can use to operationalize the runnings of a nation, right? So I don't think you could use Creolization as a framework to think about more bureaucratic or logistic issues like, you know, dividing resources or national security, you know, like the sort of bureaucratic foundations of what it means to be a nation state. I don't think Creolization could be deployed that way, but what I do think, and this is what I'm trying to convey in Creolizing the nation instead of nationalizing the Creole, is to say all of those things, all of those machinations of what a nation just has to do, given the fact that we have to divide stuff up, and we have to protect ourselves from threat and that sort of thing. What I think Creolization can do is sort of imbue or inject the playing out of those bureaucratic practices with a certain kind of spirit, right? So in other words, if we start off with the assumption that otherness or difference is not necessarily allergy or contagion, then what those bureaucratic processes would look like, I think, would be very different from if you start off with a different sort of founding premise, which is that everything that is other is scary. And now we're going to set up who are the scary boogeyman others and who aren't, and that will give you a very different playing out of things like dividing resources and so on and so forth. So to answer your question, what this would mean for countries and societies on a certain side of colonial history, in other words, societies who were former colonies and who have very specific urgencies, economic urgencies to tend to, will be very different from what it means to be a nation like the United States in a Creolizing spirit. And I very much plan to address those qualifications in the larger project. So that's a really good question. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes.
How do you-
Sorry.
Oh.
Did I? Yeah.
I don't know how we're coming.
Yes.
How do we go about like making this happen? Like making, yeah.
Okay. You know, give life to the question. So for one, I think a step one to how we go about making this happen is just entertain the question. Is this way of being a nation, is this way of forming community and experiencing community, is this the only option on the table? Is this inevitable? And give ourselves permission to imagine how it could be otherwise. I think that alone, and that's really what I'm trying to do in the project, I think that alone is a small first step, but I think it's pretty powerful. just ask a question. Well, to say that, to ask, is it possible to do things differently? Because that doesn't seem to be a question that, at least to my mind, has much traction.
Please join me in thanking Professor Sealey.